Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another Culture Conversations with REMCo. I am Shamela Cromartie. I'm the current chair of REMCo, and in this webinar today, we will have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Nicole Cook of the iSchool at Illinois. Our webinar today is titled, Let's Talk About Power, Why Diversity and Cultural Competence are Important in LIS. So before we go any further, we will have our Vice Chair, Jewel Davis, to tell you more about Dr. Cook before we get started.
Dr. Cook is an assistant professor at the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Cook graduated from Rutgers University with a PhD in Communication, Information, and Library Studies in 2012, where she was also an ALA Spectrum Doctoral Fellow. Previously, she was an instruction librarian and tenured assistant professor at Montclair State University's Sprague Library. Dr. Cook's research interests include human information behavior, particularly in an online context, e-learning, and diversity and social justice in librarianship. Dr. Cook is the 2017 recipient of the ALA Achievement in Library Diversity Research Award and the 2016 recipient of the ALA Equality Award and the Loren Y. Cohen Make a Difference Award for Teaching and Mentoring and Diversity. In 2007, she was named a mover and shaker by Library Journal. Dr. Cook is professionally active in ALA, ALICE, ASIS&T, and several other professional library organizations. Please welcome Dr. Cook, and we thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much. I actually came here to teach public services. So I came to teach reference, to teach instruction, also to teach human information behavior. But when I got here, I discovered essentially a gap in the curriculum, and there were really no opportunities for students to learn about diversity, cultural competence, social justice, or related issues, related topics in the curriculum. And initially, when I realized that that gap was there, I didn't necessarily think that I would be doing anything explicitly to address that gap. However, when I started teaching, and I was teaching, those public services classes, it was not at all uncommon for me to be the only person of any color, any visible diversity in the room. And that started to become an issue. So for the most part, students viewed it as an opportunity, as something exciting, and really embrace this idea of having a new perspective, right? From not only from a new assistant professor, but also from an African-American woman. But unfortunately, there were some incidents, there were some folks who didn't look at this as an opportunity. And so that's when it occurred to me that I needed to figure out how to address issues of diversity and cultural competence, social justice, etc., in the curriculum, because my feeling was if these students were not prepared, willing, or able to deal with me, what was going to happen when they got into the field? What was going to happen when they needed to interface and serve members of diverse communities and diverse populations? So with that said, I started teaching a class entitled Information Services to Diverse Populations, and you can see the cover of the book that came out in December of 2016. And this book was informed by the teaching of this class. And two of the other classes that I teach, social justice in the information professions, and also race, gender, and sexuality in the information professions. So the social justice class and the race, gender, and sexuality class, these were dormant classes that had been taught sporadically by doctoral students, occasionally, and also I should add they were taught by doctoral students of color. And so when they graduated, the courses fell by the wayside. So I was able to pull those two classes back into the curriculum, and all three of these classes have now been regularized and are now permanent parts of our curriculum. So this is just to give you a sense of what I'm doing at the iSchool, and just to let you know for certain that I am absolutely committed to this idea of diversity in library and information science, and we should be addressing this not only in the field but also from my perspective, in our graduate program so people are better prepared to work with our diverse populations. So I set the stage a little bit for you in terms of describing to you what I do here at Illinois and giving you a little bit of an idea of my philosophy about why I think that this is all important. But specifically, you know, if you think about our associations, our profession's code of ethics, specifically the ALA's code of ethics, it is stated that professional librarians must provide the highest level of service to all library users through appropriate and usefully organized resources, equitable service policies, equitable access, and accurate, unbiased, and courteous responses to all requests. Right? So they're using the word equity, which is very important. And I think this is something that we should be really calling out and really paying explicit attention to when we are in our workplaces. And so this idea of providing equitable service and equitable access, excuse me, these are things that are ongoing and dynamic processes, and these are things that should not only be exhibited by librarians who are on the front lines, who are on the ground, if you will, working with patrons. These are commitments that should be reflected in our policies, in our mission statement, in our vision statements, and it really should be an organizational commitment. Now, with that said, you know, obviously there are organizations who do not have that commitment from the top down, from leadership in that way. So it becomes more important for us to be able to accomplish these things on the ground and also become advocates for our diverse populations and also for our profession in terms of diversifying the profession as well. So to continue on with this idea of why diversity matters, I have a couple of statistics from the ALA Diversity Counts report. You may be familiar with that. And so, as I'm sure you realize, librarianship has long been a profession dominated by women, specifically white women. And according to the updated edition of the Diversity Counts document, in this document reported 2009-2010 data that was derived from the Census Bureau. White women comprise 72.5% of credentialed librarians in the country. And then the updated diversity counts report, which was released in 2012, states that there was an inconsiderable gain in the percentage of racial and ethnic minorities working as credentialed librarians. And this was from 11% in the year 2000 to 12% in the years 2009-2010. So hopefully we've seen, you know, more of a 1% gain now that it's 2017. But with that said, we still don't have a critical mass of librarians of color, diverse librarians in the workforce. So this is even in spite initiatives such as the Spectrum Initiative, ARL's initiative to recruit a diverse workforce. All of these really long-term and substantial initiatives that have literally put forth hundreds of people, supported them in graduate LIS programs. This is not being reflected in our workforce. So this is problematic. Not only should the field be more diverse, but the field should be more representative of the communities being served by libraries and other information organizations. And so as part of this commitment to diversity and really thinking about why diversity matters, why cultural competence matters, our diverse communities are complex and intersectional. And so what you can see on the screen is just a visual illustration of the idea of intersectionality. And so every person that comes into our library, whether they are from a diverse population or not, everyone has multiple identity markers, both visible and invisible. And so this idea that we should be considering all of the dimensions of our patrons. We should be looking at our patrons holistically and thinking about them as whole people, right? So, being an ethnic minority is a visible marker, right? So that is something for us to consider, but consider all of the other dimensions of a person's identity and personality that are not visible. So perhaps they had been incarcerated. Perhaps they had at one point been a new American. Perhaps they are a member of the LGBTQIA community. Perhaps they were homeless at one point. Maybe they're still homeless. You can't actually see that all the time. That's not always a visible marker. So how are we addressing and looking at our patrons as whole people and not just trying to focus and serve the one dimension that we can see or the one dimension that we think is the easiest to address? So with that in mind, not only are our patrons complex and intersectional, we ourselves as information professionals are also complex and intersectional. And so when I talk about intersectionality in my classes, I give the students an example of, what you can see here on the screen and what you saw on the previous screen. And I give them a personal example and say, as someone with a PhD, as someone with graduate education, that affords me certain privileges on a university campus, in a school, on a university faculty, right? But when I leave campus, I am an African-American woman who has a consistent fear of being pulled over by the police, right? So this idea that our multiple identities, parts of who we are, can often be in conflict with one another, right? So there are certain parts of our identity that afford us power and privilege, and then there are other dimensions of our identity that may put us at a disadvantage and may actually prove to marginalize us in some way. And so the reason that I really talk quite a bit about intersectionality is this idea of critical self-reflection. And this idea that in order to understand our patrons and our communities, we must first understand ourselves. In order to have empathy for our patrons and our communities, we have to be looking at them as whole people, and we need to first, recognize how we ourselves are whole people before we can do that for our communities. So I just want to step back a little bit and talk a little bit about history in the profession, right? So this idea that we have concrete need to be concerned about diversity and cultural competence and social justice in our profession. And so our profession has a long history with social justice, a long history with perhaps not always being on the right side of diversity. We have a long history of segregated libraries, particularly in the south of the country. And this is not history that is always well known or always talked about in classes and, in professional development and things of that nature. Certainly we're doing, a much better job of discussing these things now. But it's this idea that we need to really be recognizing the history in order for us to hopefully not repeat it. And we need to acknowledge our history in order to disrupt it. Okay, so we can not go back to Jim Crow era or segregated libraries, although there are still some segregated libraries in the sense that depending on perhaps what part of town they're in or what part of the country they're in, some libraries don't have the same collections and same resources as other libraries. So there is still some de facto segregation going on as well. So this is not to say that there aren't libraries that aren't excelling in embracing their diverse populations, and they're providing quality, customized services, and I'll give you a few examples of those coming up. And these libraries are doing phenomenal work when it comes to serving their patrons, right? But these are the accounts that should be the rule and not the exception. So before I move on to the next slide, I just wanted to recommend a couple of things in the event that you are particularly interested in the history of segregation and diversity in our profession. So two of the biggest names in this area, Dr. Wayne Wiegand. Now I have on the screen here his latest article, but he also has 2 books that talk about the history of the American Public Library, particularly in the South. The other name to know is Dr. Cheryl Knott. Now on this citation here, she's listed as Malone, but her name is Cheryl Knott. She's at the University of Arizona. And she also has a recent book detailing segregation in libraries. A classic article is Rosemary DeMont talking about the education of Black librarians. So this idea of the segregation in librarianship also very much extends to the history of library education. And so I've also done some work on a particular group of students that were here at Illinois in the early 70s and what they went through in terms of segregation, what we would now refer to as microaggressions, et cetera. So 40 years later, from a lot of when some of this work was done and things were documented, we are still having some of the same conversations. We are still having some of the same dilemmas in terms of diversifying our LIS workforce, retaining librarians of color, right? And in addition to trying our best to serve our diverse populations. So I've alluded to it, but now I want to explicitly talk a little bit about privilege and power. And yes, it's even real in library and information science. So I want to show you this video. It's a short video, something that I show in class, and then I will move on to another topic. So just bear with me.
Born into families where they have to walk miles just to get water. All I have to do is turn on a faucet. That's privilege.
I think privilege is when some people have some things and other people don't have things.
I feel privilege is something that you don't even really have control over.
I think it'd be silly for me to say I don't have a fair amount of privilege, considering like the country I live in, the job I get to do, and the college I was allowed to go to.
I suppose being a white male will help me end up somewhere towards the front, but I'll take a few steps back from being gay.
I don't think I'll make it to the front. I think I'll maybe be in the middle. That's just the gut feeling I have.
If your parents work nights and weekends to support your family, take one step back. If you can show affection for your romantic partner in public without fear of ridicule or violence, take one step forward. If you are embarrassed about your clothes or house while growing up, take one step back. If you have ever been diagnosed as having a physical or mental illness or disability, take one step back. If you've ever been bullied or made fun of based on something you can't change, take one step back. If you get time off for your religious holidays, take one step forward. If you came from a supportive family environment, if you can see a doctor whenever you feel the need, if you are able to move through the world without fear if you took out loans for your education, if there were more than 50 books in your house. So these are your final positions.
I think it felt kind of strange for everyone.
It's a hard thing to discuss or even reflect on.
It was very awkward.
I think when you can represent it so visually like this and so immediately, it definitely takes on a new form.
I think we were like all joking around in the beginning. It was pretty lighthearted. And as soon as the questions started coming in,
the mood shifted immediately, and we all it was just silent. Just looking back and seeing like a bunch of people behind you is not a good feeling.
It's like weird how you want to like hold on to explaining a certain privilege, like, oh, but that's not actually me, because like I had to work really hard for that. So it's weird to like take a step forward when you feel like you're taking a step forward with someone else, but you wear a lot of the baggage of like how those things are hard.
It was like more emotional than I thought it would be.
It reminded me of when they talk about slavery in high school and you feel like angry for a few days, but then you just realize like this is how it is.
For me, it was kind of frustrating almost to look back and see how much further some people were behind me, and realizing that, a lot of that stuff, no amount of hard work or even legislation can make up that gap. It's interesting being an Asian American because you're not really sure where you fall on the spectrum of privilege.
I know that for me, one of the reasons I ended up so far back was that there are questions around safety as an African American, as a woman, as a gay woman. There are just so many different ways that I don't feel safe.
I feel like I just learned to be grateful for what you have. We're in such a huge society where it's always complaining about what you don't have. It just shows you that for some families, like each family, you're meant to do better. My grandparents did good. My parents did good, and I'll do even better.
I do think if you're not like aware of privilege, you should do this exercise, but it's more complicated.
Okay, so returning to that, I just wanted to make sure that I verbally notated that the video that you just saw is based on an article entitled White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, and that is by Peggy McIntosh. And so if you Google that, I mean, I have the link here, but if you Google it, it should come right up in terms of reading that actual article. And so when we're talking about privilege explicitly, part of the reason to really bring this up is, the same idea of recognizing our own intersectionality. We also have to be, we have to recognize the mechanisms of injustice, that we deal with not only as information professionals, but as people in the society, right? And so this idea of paying attention to marginalized groups and being aware of what they're dealing with, because that works together, to influence our interactions and influence the services and collections that we provide, and also how our patrons are able to interact with us and make use of those collections and services that we are working to provide for them. In addition to this idea of being able to recognize and identify the mechanisms of injustice, part of that is also recognizing the status quo of things. So this idea that, what we deal with is not brand new, right? This is the product of generations of behaviors and decisions and coordinated behaviors informed by our culture. Right. So just, when we are currently in 2017 and we're hearing a lot about Black Lives Matter and other movements, right? We did this with the civil rights movement. It happened even before the civil rights movement. So this is ongoing, right? So just as our society is dynamic and ongoing, so should our efforts to work against that and make improvements. And I'm trying to move things around so you can actually see the citations here. So the idea of status quo is from a book by Charles Tilly entitled Durable Inequality. So for another book that I would highly recommend, and is something that I share with students in terms of talking about power and privilege, is a book called On Being Included by Sarah Ahmed. And she talks a lot about diversity as happy talk, diversity as a commodity, right? So when we're thinking about happy talk, we're thinking about organizations, whether they are higher ed organizations, whether they are public libraries, they do diversity, right? Because it's the right thing to do. And when we do diversity because it's the right thing to do, or because we're trying to keep up with the Joneses, if you will, and we do it and we don't actually believe it, that becomes an issue. And that's how diversity remains trendy, right? I've had people say to me, well, diversity is trendy again. And then my response is, I've been doing this work for many years. I don't consider it trendy, right? This is my everyday work. But it's when you think about it as a commodity and just something to do and check a box, that's when it becomes trendy. And that's unfortunately why sometimes diversity remains a trend with some people. So to finish the explicit discussion about privilege, I have the link here, and I can certainly send these links and such to Shamela and Jewel for your reference. This is a clip from the Colbert Show, The Late Show, and he had DeRay McKesson on, who is a well-known activist. And it's a really interesting segment. It's about 10 minutes long, so I won't show it here. But it was interesting to see this fairly mainstream discussion of privilege, right? So, I think it's to our benefit and to the profession's benefit to have these very explicit conversations and not be afraid of, having these conversations that, can be hard to have, and also sometimes incorporate, taboo topics and terms that we don't necessarily like to use because they make people uncomfortable. And to that, I would say we need to be uncomfortable, or excuse me, we need to be comfortable with the idea of being uncomfortable, right? We're not going to necessarily make progress if we can't have honest conversations, right? It's these honest conversations that will hopefully engender change in our workplaces and in the profession. So to that end, in terms of making change, we need to be thinking about transformation and transformative library services. So in order for us to improve the profession, we can't romanticize it. We can't ignore the history. We can't ignore the privilege that we see going on in our communities that then impacts our libraries. And so I know that you had a session on social justice during a previous webinar, and that's where the social justice comes in, right? So what are we actually doing to disrupt the status quo, to disrupt privilege, and further work towards equity? So just as a concept, there is a concept called transformative library services. And for those who like to do extra research, I would look up library and information science educator, Dr. Lorna Peterson. And Dr. Peterson wrote in the late 90s about why LIS needs diversity and why we should be using explicit language, in the sense that terms like multiculturalism, or even now things like diversity, they're not as precise as they should be. And if we talk about diversity and multiculturalism, and to some extent even inclusion, it allows us to kind of talk on these broad meta-level terms that can easily ignore the harder terms like race, privilege, oppression, and the things that are a little bit more uncomfortable. Then there is also Dr. Clara Chu, who talks about really looking at LIS through a socio-political context, right? And not just looking at the library and LIS in a silo, right? We should be looking at context, at how the world around us impacts our profession and the work that we try to do. So another dimension of this transformation is cultural competence. And I won't spend too much time on that, but just to give you a sense of how I'm looking at things. And again, move this so you can see. So this idea that cultural competence is an ongoing process, and this idea that we want to move past things like cultural destructiveness and cultural incapacity. Those are things that say that people recognize the differences in other diverse communities, and they're actively trying to work against it, right? These would be your hate groups and other things of that nature. Another thing that we need to be mindful of and working against is the idea of cultural blindness. And cultural blindness is color blindness, essentially, this idea that we don't see color and that we treat everyone the same. And, you know, that could look good on paper, but it doesn't allow us to really celebrate the differences in our diverse communities if we purposely choose not to see those differences. And then as we move up on the graphic here, we have cultural pre-competence and cultural competence and cultural proficiency. And when we start getting into the top half of the graphic, this is where action is implied, right? So you have this knowledge of diverse communities, you are on board, you want to celebrate these differences, and now you're actually able to do something about it. You are able to improve your collections. You are able to have programming that reflects your diverse communities. You are able to actually do something. So again, this link to social justice in that we are now acting on the knowledge that we have. And I can also send Jewel and Shamela a reference to a chapter that I wrote that really kind of explains this graphic in much greater detail. The other thing that I wanted to mention to you is this idea of counter storytelling. And I think that that goes hand in hand with the cultural competence and really enables us to have a way to act, right? It gives us a way to employ the action. And counter storytelling, it comes out of critical race theory, which is actually a legal theory that came out several decades ago, but is now seen a lot in education. It is now becoming more common in LIS as well. And it's really this idea of telling a different story, right? So think of it this way, and I'll actually go to the first slide to show you this. So when we think about librarians and who librarians are, what librarians look like, the stereotype is of an older white woman, glasses, pearls, bun in her hair, cardigan, you know, all of those things. And so stereotypes, also known as stock stories, these are the stories that the public knows. These are the stories that even, you know, exist still in the profession. And it really is the normalizing or the normalizing of a particular set of norms, right? And so then that leaves us out librarians of color. There are, you know, multiple groups on social media, tattooed librarians, any type of counter story, if you will, right? This idea of trying to push back against these stereotypes and really display all of the different types of people that work in this field. So in terms of moving past the stock stories or the stereotypes, we also have concealed stories, right? And concealed stories are direct responses to stock stories these are stories that are not mainstream and depict some form of struggle or disagreement with the common knowledge promoted by stock stories. So these would be stories of survival or overcoming the stereotypes, if you will. So what I have on the screen here is a book that just came out. You may be familiar with this, the campaign, This Is What a Librarian Looks Like. And it is a concerted effort to say librarians come in all shapes, sizes, and colors. It's not just the stereotypical white female, bun, glasses, etc. The next type of story that we may encounter are resistance stories, right? So this goes back to what I showed you earlier in terms of library history and how we manage to move beyond that and move into libraries that are integrated and are really working towards embracing diverse populations. So resistance stories are those that when they are revealed, that the listener may think or even say, I had no idea, or perhaps how can that be, right? So lots of my students will say, I didn't know that libraries were segregated. And I think that's important for people to know, not only because it is a part of the history, but it gives a sense of being able to resist or overcome. Now, what I really wanted to get to is this idea of emerging or transformative stories. And this is where I think we have a lot of potential. We have a lot of capability to really change the narrative of what people think librarianship is and what LIS is. And so on the screen here, this is a picture of Melanie Townsend Diggs. Melanie is the librarian at the Enoch Pratt Free Library System in Baltimore. And hers was the branch that was in the middle of the Baltimore uprising when Freddie Gray passed away. And so the reason that I mention this, and I also mention the Ferguson Public Library a lot when I talk about these things, is that a lot of the reaction was, I had no idea that librarians did that. And isn't it wonderful that these libraries stayed open in the middle of all this chaos and confusion? And, you know, both Melanie and Scotty Bonner, who is the librarian at Ferguson, will say immediately, this is what we do. This is not unusual for us. And this is part of the perception that we need to work towards changing. This is why it's important for us to be culturally competent so we can engage in our community, so they can get to know us better, so that they, when they hear the word librarian, they will think of Melanie and not, you know, some of the pictures that I showed you earlier about the stereotypical librarian. So the last thing that I wanted to mention to you, and you know, this is a topic we could do another webinar on, is this idea of culturally responsive pedagogy. And I think that even as librarians, as LIS professionals, we should have a philosophy of service. We should be engaged in having a culturally responsive pedagogy towards our diverse communities and our patrons. And in a really, really brief nutshell, this idea of culturally responsive pedagogy is the idea of essentially being culturally competent and aware of your diverse communities and using that information to better serve them, right? So you know, say for example, you have a large Somali population in your community. When you get to know that community, when you get to know them as people, when you get to know them as whole people, that can radically change how we serve them. Right, this realization that our diverse populations, they are the experts in what they need. So just thinking about librarians having a personal pedagogy in that way. So I am pushing up on my time here, but just wanting to end by saying, I think it's really important for us to be mindful of our communities, welcome our communities, to celebrate our communities. And I think part of that is, again, being reflective as professionals, to actively be engaging in self-reflection and learning from the communities themselves. And this idea that we want to change the story of the profession, we want to help change the stories of our communities, and that's going to require dedication and action on our part, but it is so worthwhile, and we are seeing so many wonderful examples lately, even with you know, Dr. Hayden being the new Librarian of Congress. So we are seeing wonderful examples, and I hope that we can continue this work in these conversations so we can continue to create future examples and future stories. So with that in mind, I will stop talking and see if I can get the screen back in case folks have questions.
Hi, Dr. Cook.
Yes.
I had one question come in earlier. It says, as a former ed reformer in philanthropy, we had a common definition and a shared understanding of equity. In LIS, I am not sure there's a shared definition of the term. When you speak of equity, how do you understand the term?
Yes, I would agree that we probably don't have a shared definition, and that's why I do all the writing and speaking in this arena. And I think depending on the community within LIS that you're asking, like I feel like, you know, there are colleagues that I have that we have a very particular idea of equity, and then I can go talk to um, other colleagues who are not part of marginalized groups, and they have a very different idea of equity. So in terms of, you know, what I'm thinking about, and I wish I had put this particular graphic up for you, but you may have seen online this idea of it's a cartoon image, 3 children at a baseball game, and they're on different step stools, right? And one has a better vantage point than the other. And this idea that inclusion doesn't always equal equity, right? So then if you move to the other frame of that cartoon, the step stools are now leveled, right? So now not only do the children have the same type of access, they have the same vantage point to actually be able to use the information and the resources in comparison with others. So I'm looking at it as not only access, but moving towards equity in the sense that people have consistent and equal access, and not just, you know, entry to the game, but able to use resources and have access across the board. But I do agree that we still have work to do in terms of moving towards a general definition across the field.
Okay. We had another participant that wanted to know what was the name of the 2 classes that you teach on a regular basis.
Sure. So there's 3 of them. The one, and let me see if I can get back to this slide for you. One of them is Information Services to Diverse Populations. That is a general survey class that introduces folks to diverse populations. There's another one called Race, Gender, and Sexuality in the Information Professions. And then the third class is Social Justice in the Information Professions. And I should add, you know, that these courses are open to anyone that would like to take them through continuing professional development. That is part of my mission, if you will, to be able to, you know, share this with others who would like the information. And so again, I can pass that along to Jewel and Shamela about if people are interested in pursuing that as an option.
Okay. Another question is, a number of libraries have developed diversity committees to address the lack of diversity within their libraries. What advice can you give to these committees on activities that will help with inclusion and equity?
Sure. My first reaction to that is, you know, I'm on the diversity committee here at the iSchool and all of these things. And I think that sometimes the committees get into that happy talk that I mentioned earlier, the idea of we have a diversity committee because we have to have one, right? And if you're not, if everyone is not really committed, then, you know, that becomes another issue. But in terms of how to go about it, I think that the best way to do it, or among the best ways to accomplish, you know, some good through these committees, is to have a variety of different programs, resources, some resources that are passive, some resources that are very active, and this idea of not trying to scold anyone or shame anyone into doing better, right? Are there programs that we can implement to say, let's do this because we're good people, and let's do this because our patrons deserve the best possible service, and not because you should be guilty and the diversity committee is going to, you know, teach you how to be a better person. I think it depends on the approach. I was talking to a class the other day, and someone had a similar question, and she was a youth services person. And there is a campaign called Reading Beyond Walls. And it's this idea of just challenging people, read books that don't have characters that look like you, or read books that take place in another part of the world that you're not familiar with. And the approach is, again, the same, this idea of just trying to, you know, be better people, right? And just to learn and have fun, as opposed to diversity being a chore and a trend that we just have to address.
Okay. And you may have addressed some of that in what you just said, but we had another question that says, what are some of the first steps in trying to develop a culturally competent staff? And that is in terms of the staff themselves and not necessarily the people they serve.
Yeah, I think we have to engage in training. And I know training is not always, looked at positively. I do training here with my faculty, and these are my direct colleagues who are very happy to let me teach that stuff and let me be the only one who teaches about diversity. But I've brought in people to talk about microaggressions, and to say there are many different types of trainings. In my unit, I've brought in training about racial microaggressions. I've had other training about cultural competence, or how to incorporate diverse content into their classes. So I think it's about training. And I mean, there's certainly any number of articles, any number of workshops, videos, things of that nature, to kind of facilitate that training, right? So I think that there does need to be some formal training, but I would hope that people would be interested enough and want to continue that learning and growing on their own, and there are lots of resources to help accommodate that.
Okay. Another participant wanted to know if you ever make your syllabi available.
The syllabi to the diverse populations is actually in the book that's up on the screen. And the entire course structure, the entire syllabus, and plus a bibliography of I don't know how many articles are there. So it is there, yes.
Okay. And we had one last question that says, can we get a copy of the PowerPoint as well?
Yes, I will send Jewel and Shamela a PDF.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Jewel, do you see any that I don't see? Okay. Some may come in afterwards, after we get off. That's usually how it happens sometimes. Mm-hmm. But Dr. Cook, thank you so much for joining us today. That was a wealth of information that we will all take some time to digest. We will put up your information and we will send that out when we send out a link for a survey. We've also recorded this webinar, so we will also be sending that out to the registrants of the webinar, and we will send you a copy of that as well.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for having me. Have a great day.
You too.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.